Orlando now behind us, but what is in front of us? We saw a lockout, and we've seen great basketball the first half of this NBA season, but we have a long way to go to determine a champion. Thanks for joining us. I'm David Aldridge. We're going to be talking about the entire first half of this NBA season, along with several of our colleagues, starting with Steve Smith, the NBA champion and Spartan dog. Literally the man in the middle, Steve Aschburner from NBA.com, and joining us from New York, from the New York Times, two of the media stars of the lockout. Howard Beck from the New York Times, and also joining us in New York is Ken Berger from CBSSports.com. Thanks to both of you for joining us. We'll be back to you in just a second. For a few awful weeks, we didn't even know if we'd have an NBA season. But just after Thanksgiving, the league and its players reached a deal. And on Christmas Day, it was game on. In Oklahoma City, Kevin Durant and the Thunder rolled. In Miami, LeBron and Dwayne Wade put the heat on. In Los Angeles, Chris Paul and his Clippers found their footing, and we were all bowled over by Linsanity. Now that we're done with All-Star Weekend, we look ahead to the second half of the season. Who will surprise, who will disappoint, and who will win it all? But first, we have to take one last look back at 7 or 8 really bad weeks. We knew it was coming. Owners insisted they were losing hundreds of millions of dollars. Players insisted they'd already sacrificed more than enough of their money. And fans could only watch in despair as billionaires fought millionaires, and the clock ticked ominously toward the cancellation of the entire 2011-2012 season.
Basketball operations as we know them will cease indefinitely at midnight Eastern Time tonight.
At the conclusion of today's session, we were going to recommend that we lock out.
We want to play basketball. We do not want to be locked out.
We think that we've demonstrated that we're here to try to make a deal. The players' response was, we'll see you on Friday.
These things take months to negotiate. So you don't start negotiating seriously until mid-August or early September. You can kiss a lot of games, regular season games, goodbye.
Right now, the current offer that is on the table from the NBA is not one that we can accept.
I'm sorry to report, and I'm sad to report, that we've canceled the first 2 weeks. But the gap is so significant that we just can't bridge it at this time.
The question is whether or not they really want to negotiate and reach an agreement.
We're about to go into the nuclear winter of the NBA.
We're going to remain focused on finding a way to get this done.
Well, we've reached a tentative understanding, and that the NBA season will begin on December 25th, Christmas Day.
We begin this show with big news from the NBA.
We are pleased and proud to announce that the Board of Governors of the NBA has ratified a new collective bargaining agreement.
Trust me, it was worse than that. It was awful, every bit of it. You look at the numbers here, almost 150 days of lockout, 54 preseason games lost, 480 regular season games lost, 150 hours of official negotiations, add another 75 or so unofficial hours, and we don't know about how many mutant pizzas were given out. But anyway, let's look back, if we have to do this one more time. If you guys think about what the lockout brought in terms of the financial difference that we now have, but also in terms of what it did to the quality of play of the game. And you can jump in either way, but let's start with you, Smitty.
Well, you know, I looked at a DA, just go back to the lockout versus 99. I thought the gap, as far as financially, wasn't going to be able to be closed. I thought for sure the season would be canceled. But when you start to look at it back in 99, we had a longer training camp. I think right now when you play about average of 3 or 4 games a week in an 82-game season, that little lingering ankle injury, you can get through it. But now having to play maybe 5 or 6 games throughout the week, I think that's the biggest thing. Recovery time for these guys, and having a shortened training camp has really hurt somewhat of the play, and also guys being able to recover.
Steve, what about the teams? One thing David Stern said was that there's no more excuses. If you should be able to manage your team now. Every team, there's $12 million per team less in salary, 12% less salary for every team. Is it now every team should be able to compete on a more level playing field?
Well, I'll tell you, that's the reaction I hear from teams. In fact, some of the smaller markets that might have thought that their concerns weren't addressed, they seem quite interested in the whole revenue sharing process, and that seems to be what will be the salvation. That with revenue sharing, They'll be able financially to compete, even if you have a superstar problem. You know, guys wanting to move on after their first or second contract, that they'll deal with that. But as long as there's a financial give back from the big markets, that seems where the real cure was. And that was a separate track from the lockout talks. And yet, to me, that was the real answer here.
Howard, let's bring you and Kenny in here. You cover teams in New York. You cover the Knicks, obviously a big market, big revenue team. So, Howard, they're going to have to pay a lot more money in luxury tax going forward if they go over the luxury tax threshold. Has that really chilled how the Knicks will approach salaries from here on out?
Well, it clearly hasn't, because what they did right at the get-go within a week after the lockout ended was they brought in Tyson Chandler on a sign-and-trade deal that's paying him an average of about $13 million a year. They now have three guys, Carmelo Anthony, Amari Stoudemire, Tyson Chandler, who are going to be making a combined, $50 million or so, most of their cap. So they don't seem to be chilled right now. The question for a team like the Knicks, like the Heat, like some others that have stacked up on double-digit million salary players is, can you keep affording to add? And we know that the more punitive luxury tax, the advantages are going to be taken away from luxury tax teams in terms of sign-in trades. That's where we're going to see the effect, and it's not going to be for a couple more years. But the problem will be for teams that really went top-heavy in salary, can they keep adding quality players as this CBA unfolds? And I think that will be the challenge, but we won't see it for a couple of years.
Kenny, you are credited with breaking the news of the lockout ending, and I may forgive you someday for that. Your tweet right after Thanksgiving broke it down that things were done and that everybody was getting back to work, and we were all happy about that. But do you think, if you're looking at it now, we've seen a lot of big-time players go down with injuries. Do teams believe that the lack of rest, as Smitty was talking about, is leading to some more of those injuries?
Well, I think the approach is kind of looking at it as a work in progress. I don't think anybody knows for sure. I think there's certainly a suspicion among coaches and trainers that there is a cumulative effect, especially if you have an older team, that, the repetition of games, how quickly they're coming on the schedule, and the lack of practice time and the lack of time in the gym to keep their bodies healthy. I think that certainly is going to have an impact. And that's why, as I look back on that night when I sent that tweet, the thing that really comes to mind for me is this deal, as it currently is constructed, it could have been done a month earlier, 6 weeks earlier, and you would have alleviated a lot of these problems.
And Kenny, you talk about that, and I think that looking back on it, there's a lot of truth to that. But one quick follow-up. Who won this? Who won? I mean, the players gave up a lot of money, but a lot of the owners no longer, as David Stern said again, have that excuse of, well, I just can't compete in this market. So who really won?
Well, that's a great question. And, after 149 days and all the, standing around on sidewalks that we did and ordering takeout, I brought a little prop here. This is the receipt from the Last Supper for the media on that last night at the lockout. We got some baked ziti here. We got some chicken wraps and some chicken soup. And I don't know if I'm going to send this I'm going to sell it on eBay or send it to the Smithsonian. But
I certainly hope you expense that.
Oh, of course. But, who won? I think in the end everybody won in the short term just by getting a season and getting it done, because it would have been devastating otherwise. Yeah. I think it's going to play out, like Howard said, over the next couple of years. How do the big market teams respond to the restrictions, and do they actually bring up the low-spending teams? And I think that's, the jury's going to be out on that until we actually see what happens.